Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Before the interstate highway system, before famed Route 66, before highways were even numbered, there was one road that captured the public's attention. One road that led to new horizons. One road that changed America forever. Beginning in Times Square, New York City, and ending in San Francisco, it was America's first coast-to-coast automobile road. The Lincoln Highway. A little over a century ago, there was no single auto road across America. There were wagon trails and ranch paths in the west, turnpikes and farmers' lanes in the east, but mostly these roads didn't lead anywhere.
The roads of the time, what they were just simple paths through the dirt, and these were roads that ranchers and farmers would use to get to town and get back out.
At the turn of the century, there weren't that many automobiles for which to build roads, but there were bicycles.
So bicyclists actually are the ones that really started the Good Roads movement, because the roads back then, of course, were dirt, which turned to mud, and then when the mud hardened, you had hard ruts, which is fine for a horse and a buggy, but certainly someone on a bicycle, it doesn't work. So when the automobile then became more prevalent, the automobile entrepreneurs who had the financial wherewithal jumped on the bandwagon, and basically they became the fathers of the Good Road movement at that point.
Among those early auto entrepreneurs was Carl G. Fisher. Fisher was an Indiana businessman who formed the Presto Light Company, which manufactured acetylene headlights for early automobiles. He was also one of the founders of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, home of the famed Indianapolis 500 race.
Carl Fisher, who was really a promoter, really a grandstander in many ways. He was not a planner, but he had good ideas.
In 1912, Fisher conceived a hard-surfaced improved highway from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He called it the Coast-to-Coast Rock Highway. In September of that year, Fisher met with automobile industry leaders to pitch his idea and ask for donations to pay for the proposed road. Fisher felt it could be completed in time for the 1915 exposition in San Francisco. "Let's build it," he told the group, "before we're too old to enjoy it." Within 30 minutes of his speech, Frank Seiberling, president of Goodyear Tires, was so inspired he pledged $300,000. Henry Joy, president of the Packard Motor Company, enthusiastically offered $150,000.
The intention was to connect the country from East Coast to West Coast. Commerce was a big piece of it, but also to encourage people to get out and travel. But they also were patriotic and believed it would benefit the country.
Within a few months, Fisher had over $4 million in pledges from auto manufacturers and auto-related businesses, all except for one important holdout. Henry Ford was against private enterprise funding roads in America. He thought the government should be responsible. In time, he would prove to be right. The automobile had been around for a couple of decades before the Lincoln Highway, but they were expensive.
You'd see Maxwells and Premiers and occasional Studebakers and other fine automobiles, expensive automobiles that would cost 2 years' wages for a working person at that time. And these were playthings of the rich.
But in 1908, a vehicle appeared that shook up the nascent auto industry and set the stage for a revolution in personal transportation. That vehicle was the Ford Model T. The Model T was the first automobile mass-produced on moving assembly lines with completely interchangeable parts and marketed to the middle class. It was a rugged and reliable little car that could easily be repaired by its owner. Standing on 30-inch tires, it had good ground clearance, but its most important attribute was its price. Due to constantly improving mass production, the price of a new Model T dropped from $850 at its introduction to $260 by 1925. With costs coming down, Model T sales shot up. The 1 millionth Model T was produced in 1915. By 1921, 5 million of them were on the road, and just 3 years later, there were 10 million. At the end of its run in 1927, 15 million Model Ts had been manufactured. This singular vehicle propelled Henry Ford to national prominence and the Ford Motor Company to unimagined success. But more importantly, it was the car that put America on the road. People could now journey at their own pace, on their own schedule, to potentially any destination. The only problem was, there still weren't many improved roads. After pledging his company's monetary support, Henry Joy suggested a different name for Fisher's coast-to-coast rock highway.
Let's call it the Lincoln Highway. He said that to Carl Fisher, and Carl Fisher instantly knew that was the right name for it because Abraham Lincoln did link the country back together.
The Lincoln Highway Association was formed in Detroit on July 1, 1913. It was the first real attempt to develop, map, sign, and promote a road across America. Henry Joy became the association's first president. Carl Fisher was named vice president. Stringing together an assortment of existing roads, the route of the Lincoln Highway was made public on September 14, 1913. It traversed more than 3,300 miles, cutting across 12 states and 4 time zones. Bonfires and speeches, fireworks and parades occurred in hundreds of cities and towns along the route upon its dedication, October 31, 1913. But now that the road was official, reality set in. After all the promotion, all the anticipation, and all the celebrations, the Lincoln Highway was still just an assemblage of existing roads and trails. How difficult would a coast-to-coast auto trip actually be? In July 2013, members of the new Lincoln Highway Association set out to discover the answer.
Cars on the tour are wonderful because we have 100 years of cars, from 1913 clear up to present-day cars. And I love the diversity. The Lincoln Highway was for everybody.
You know, when you get out and you take the dirt roads, you really see what it was like in 1913 to 1935. And especially here, I'm in a car that was around at that time. It's just really, really neat to just go back in time and live the way they lived back then.
Standing in the sagebrush, battered by the wind. Hey, there it was. I saw it. Drive by that thing again. There's a marker made of concrete from 80 years ago, when this broken blacktop was the country's only road from coast to coast. Down the road, who was the first to think of that? Down the road, long before Jack Kerouac. Down the road, hey, grab your coat and hat.
Oh, good. Yeah, okay.
We're looking for the Lincoln Highway down the road.
Highway 30 goes through a lot of small towns that don't see the kind of traffic they used to see. They are fabulous, quaint little towns with wonderful people, and you would never get a chance to see them otherwise.
The 1916 Lincoln Highway Association Road Guide had advice for those venturing out on the new highway.
For a real vacation, nothing beats a camping trip.
The guide suggested bringing camping equipment, canned and dry food, and an assortment of rugged clothing.
The equipment was essential. They had 4 or 5 spare tires, 6 if they could get them on their car. They had tire chains. They used tire chains quite a bit. They had jacks and shovels, poles that they could stick under the bumper to lift up and get them out of the mud hole. They used flat lumber slabs for put under the tires.
Heeding the advice and warnings and purchasing the necessary provisions, early auto enthusiasts packed up their vehicles and began to venture forth on the Lincoln Highway. The Great American Road Trip was born. One such adventurer was Effie Price Gladding. In 1914, she and her husband set out from San Francisco and drove the new Lincoln Highway to New Jersey. Her ensuing book was the first of many to talk about the transcontinental route.
We resolved at the outset to take the days and the roads as they came, not looking for luxury and well satisfied with simplicity. It is surprising how one is fortified for the vicissitudes of the road by such a deliberate attitude of mind. Effie Price Gladding.
Cheyenne, Wyoming was one of 5 state capitals through which the Lincoln Highway passed. At the request of the association, Cheyenne's 16th Street was renamed Lincoln Way, a moniker that still exists today. In Cheyenne, many early travelers stayed at the Plains Hotel. Built in 1911, it was considered by locals to be the best lodging on the Lincoln Highway between Chicago and San Francisco. For those who couldn't afford a hotel, a free municipal campground was located along a lake at the north end of town. In 1920, 40,000 people camped there. Tourists from the East Coast crossing over the Laramie Mountains west of Cheyenne must have been bewildered by the dryness, the odd rock formations, and the general lack of trees along the route. This wasn't the Rocky Mountains they had envisioned, yet many were enthusiastic of the sights they encountered on this portion of the trip. One of the landmarks was the monument to Oakes and Oliver Ames, financiers and developers of the Union Pacific Railroad.
I'm here at the Ames Monument now, and I can hardly wait to get out and see the view from up here. This is really an amazing structure. It's just way cool. I'm amazed that something like this is out in the middle of Wyoming. Awesome, I love it.
Over the years, the Lincoln Highway was moved a number of times to provide motorists with a better alignment, an improved road, and a reduced distance. The original 1913 route traveled southwest along Hermosa Road, then to Tie Siding, where it turned north and followed today's Highway 287 through Red Buttes and on to Laramie. But by 1919, a new Lincoln Highway segment was opened. It continued due west from Ames Monument and on to Sherman Hill Summit, highest point on the Lincoln at 8,835 feet. In the 1920s, a gas station and roadhouse known as the Summit Tavern was built on Sherman Summit. With improvements to the highway, the Summit Tavern also improved over the years. Today, there's a rest stop on the interstate, not far from the original high point of the Lincoln Highway. Here, modern travelers stop to see 2 memorials that stand high above the freeway. The bronze head of Lincoln was designed and created in 1958 by a University of Wyoming art professor, Robert Russin. Due to the extremes of Wyoming's temperatures, he cast the sculpture in Mexico. It was shipped to Laramie and trucked to its original destination on Sherman Hill, where it was dedicated. Russin said that he wanted to show a contemplative Lincoln in the last years of his life, his great heart sorrowing over the rent of his nation. Another memorial at the Summit rest stop sits next to that of Lincoln. The Henry B. Joy Monument honors the first president of the Lincoln Highway Association and the president of the Packard Motor Car Company. Joy was an avid outdoorsman who drove cross-country multiple times, testing the latest production Packards. He often encountered unfavorable conditions, but loved every minute away from the corporate boardroom. His memorial was moved to the rest area from a remote site near Creston, Wyoming, about 100 miles to the west.
Where we're standing at right now is the site of the original Henry Joy Monument. The story goes that he was really enamored of the Wyoming sunset and decided that maybe he wanted to be buried here. In 1939, his wife placed a monument here at this location, and this monument remained here until it got moved to the Lincoln rest stop between Cheyenne and Laramie.
After cresting Sherman Summit, the Lincoln Highway descended west through Telephone Canyon into Laramie. Wyoming road workers built the Lincoln Highway through this tight canyon from 1919 to 1920. It was an amazing feat of engineering that shaved miles off the trip.
The whole idea of the Western, of the cowboy, was really coming into its fore in the early 20th century. People loved Western movies. So these travelers would get to Wyoming and they'd meet cowboys. They'd see people herding cattle. They would get to interact with these folks in cafes and saloons and hotels and things in towns along the Lincoln Highway.
We came to Laramie, reaching there on the eve of the 4th of July. Laramie boasts a good hotel, which was crowded with people. Ranchmen had brought their families for the festivities of the 4th. Tall cowboys lounged about, wearing their most ornamental tall boots, their best silk shirts, and brightest neckties. Effie Price Gladding.
Laramie was home to a true Wyoming auto pioneer, Elmer Lovejoy. Always a tinkerer and inventor, he had a garage on South 2nd Avenue where he built bicycles. But in 1898, he was hard at work on a new project.
What Elmer Lovejoy did in May of 1898 was to take some of his skills in repairing bicycles and some of those bicycle parts that he had in his shop and put it together with an internal combustion engine mounted on 4 wheels and drive around Laramie in May of 1898 in what was Wyoming's first car.
Soon, Lovejoy, E.L. Emery, and others in Wyoming began publishing travel guides for motorists. These guides often had detailed turn-by-turn instructions, but failed to mention the poor road conditions. But rudimentary maps and misleading descriptions were the least of the problems encountered by early Lincoln Highway travelers.
The drive was pretty tough. It was unmarked in most places. It was dirt or mud or a little gravel now and then. There was really no paving to speak of outside of towns and cities. Even when the road was marked, if it rained, you might get into some pretty serious mud holes because it was just natural road. There was no paving, no improvement, no embankment of any kind.
Some farmers and ranchers came to the aid of stuck motorists, often accepting no payment for their efforts. Others detested autos, especially the initial wave of wealthy owners who obliviously ran over chickens and other farm animals. They often fought back by scattering tacks along the road. Some ranchers in Wyoming disliked automobiles so much they would sometimes threaten motorists with guns. Others sought revenge using less hostile tactics.
And the guidebooks would say helpful things like, turn right at the red barn. And then the farmer would paint the barn white, and then you were lost. So these things took a while to iron out until things got better marked.
But eventually, farmers and ranchers began to accept autos, especially the Model T, which could navigate rocky, muddy trails and could even be used as a power plant for ranch machinery. In Wyoming and other states, fences surrounding farms and ranches often blocked the way. The early route of the Lincoln Highway between Laramie and Rawlins had no less than 18 gates through which motorists had to stop, open, and close again. Alternative routes were often advertised. Bridges were another problem. because at first there weren't too many of them. To cross a stream bed or dry ravine, side banks were cut and large rocks moved before cars could push across. To avoid this effort, some travelers used railroad bridges, sometimes consulting with railroad time schedules, sometimes not, with all the danger that implied. But in 1916, local communities were working hard to improve the highway that passed through their towns. Fix the bad places first was their credo. They installed culverts, reinforced bridges, filled holes, and smoothed out ruts. The Lincoln Highway Association encouraged and sponsored civic groups and businesses along the route to get it marked.
In terms of signage, the Lincoln Highway first tried to get local groups out to mark the highway in any way they could. The red, white, and blue pole painting with the L was one of the first ways. Just simple wooden signs that would say, this way to Evanston, this way to Wamsutter.
From Laramie to Medicine Bow, the section of Lincoln Highway along US 30 has been called the best in Wyoming. But in 1912 and 1913, a furious battle raged over the route of the Lincoln Highway between Laramie and Rawlins.
Really, the big struggle was Medicine Bow versus Elk Mountain. And we have a hotel in Medicine Bow, the Virginian, and then we have the Elk Mountain Hotel. So there's a big battle, and they both lobby the Lincoln Highway Association to make a case for why the highway should go through their town.
August Grimm was an entrepreneur, saloon owner, and first mayor of Medicine Bow. His landmark Virginian Hotel had electric lights, indoor plumbing, and cost a whopping $65,000 to build.
The hotel was completed in 1911, had a grand opening. 2 months later, the Union Pacific stopping their trains in Medicine Bow. And Grimm was stuck with this huge white elephant, which wasn't making any money at all without the trains. He had heard that there was going to be a transcontinental highway across the United States. He was determined to make sure that that highway came through Medicine Bow in order to save his floundering business, the Virginian Hotel.
Meanwhile, the town fathers of Elk Mountain bragged about its fine hotel and the abundance of innumerable springs and streams of nice, clear, cool, good water. That a route through their area was also 18 miles shorter. But August Grimm was not to be denied. He got together with like-minded businessmen and formed a plan.
He decided that they had to take matters into their own hands. He called some of his cronies in one afternoon in his bar in Medicine Bow, and he said, we're going to have to do this ourselves because we can't get a decision out of anybody else. So the group sat down and they made about 60 of these facsimile Lincoln Highway signs. And in one day they signed the entire route from Laramie to Rawlins with these facsimile signs. He then invited the Laramie Chamber of Commerce and the Rawlins Chamber of Commerce to drive the route to Medicine Bow. When they got to Medicine Bow, they were feted by a cocktail party in the Home Ranch Saloon and then a meal in the Virginian Hotel. After this was all done and they got back home, they contacted the state engineer, this gentleman, Mr. Parshall, and they said, what's the problem? The highway was already marked. It's already located. There's no use fighting over this anymore. So Parshall then agreed, and that's how the highway got to Medicine Bow. It was strictly by the relentless effort of Grimm and the take the bull by the horns attitude that he had that brought Lincoln Highway to Medicine Bow.
In the 1960s, the tables turned on Medicine Bow. The new Interstate 80 traveled west past Elk Mountain and bypassed all the towns between Laramie and Rawlins along the old Lincoln Highway.
Medicine Bow had 57 small businesses when I-80 opened in 1970. We now have 5. It killed Medicine Bow. It killed Rock River. It killed Bosler. I-80 was a disaster for our town and for the towns that existed along the original route.
By the 1920s, the Lincoln Highway and auto touring had captured the imagination of the middle and working classes. People were being paid better wages. They had more leisure time due to a shortened work week, and they were purchasing automobiles, mostly the Model T. As a result, many Americans began taking longer auto trips, packing up their autos with camping gear and luggage, loading in their families. They followed their guidebooks and struck out for new horizons on the Lincoln Highway.
Rolling down that Lincoln Highway, the oldest road from shore to shore, built way back when by those hard-working men. They had a dream, but they still wanted more. Now old Abe Lincoln was a straight-shooting man. He shot a question to the soul of this land. Shouldn't all men be free and accept a different crowd? Yes, the answer's ringing clear and loud. Rolling down that Lincoln Highway, rolling down that Lincoln Highway, rolling down that Lincoln Highway, rolling down that Lincoln Highway.
These new travelers couldn't afford hotels and fine meals. They barely had enough for food and gas. They would simply pull over onto any open land and set up camp, often without asking permission. These budget auto travelers were called tin can tourists, not because of the Model T Tin Lizzies they drove, but because of the food they ate out of tin cans.
As we drive along, we constantly see the remains of former camps by the roadside. Old tin tea kettles, pieces of worn-out camp stools, piles of tin cans. These are mute and inglorious monuments to the bivouacs of other days. These immense plateau states are very dependent upon canned foods, and all along, tin cans mark the trail. Effie Price Gladding.
But at one location in Wyoming, tourists left more than their tin can refuse.
We're standing at an inscription site along a segment of the Lincoln Highway between Rock Springs and Rawlins. Just like the Overland Trail immigrants in the 1840s and 50s who stopped at Independence Rock to sign their names, the travelers here on the Lincoln Highway also stopped here and scratched their names and initials into the rocks.
Camps sponsored by cities and towns began to grow because tourists were trashing farmers' fields and ranch lands with their litter.
If there didn't happen to be anybody in the community who was willing to provide the kinds of services that travelers may wish to avail themselves of, to maybe stop and throw up a tent and camp, the municipality would go ahead and do it because they recognized pretty early on that people who stopped at a free campground in the close proximity of the town would spend some money in the local community.
Tourist traffic on the Lincoln Highway proved to be a financial bonanza for towns both large and small. Auto repair garages and restaurants, hotels and gas stations. Tourist stops of all varieties reap the rewards of the Lincoln Highway.
People realized maybe a little shelter from the Wyoming wind would be nice, and they built little cabins. Well, and then pretty soon these cabins were kind of popular. Let's kind of put them all in a row and put them together, and we'll call it the motel. And that was really the development of the first sort of roadside motel. These elongated rows of rooms that early on often had a little garage between each cabin.
These cottages were built in the early 1920s, and 26, 30. People started using them all the time for camping at night. They had showers, garages, park in, and all the facilities, inside. They were really great. And they mushroomed all over town.
Part motel, part camping facility, travelers could get a good night's rest, take a shower, and rustle up a meal, all for a very affordable price.
We're at the Sunset Cabins in Evanston, Wyoming, one of our great cultural resources in our community that typifies what happened when the Lincoln Highway in its heyday went right next door here. And the cabins were built in the 20s. They were the first lodging cabins in Evanston.
Astonishingly, the remains of the cabins are still standing but are in dire need of repair and restoration. So the cabins are there, campground over here. That's fantastic.
Some wise enough to build into their business the whole identity of gas, food, and lodging. You could buy gas, you could get a sandwich, and you could rent a little tourist cabin.
One business in particular rose from the ranks of mom-and-pop establishments to become a major player in the travel service industry: Little America. Little America was founded in 1934 by Stephen Mack Covey. As a young sheepherder, the story goes, he once spent the night without shelter when a blizzard struck and temperatures plummeted to 40 below. After surviving this ordeal, he was inspired to build an oasis for travelers he called Little America, after Admiral Byrd's encampment in the Antarctic. The penguin became its logo. At first, the business was a modest affair, located near Granger, Wyoming, with 12 cabins, 2 gas pumps, and 24 seats in the cafe. It was a handy stop on the Lincoln for gas, food, and a good night's sleep. Soon a cocktail lounge called the Palm Room was added. Later, a hotel was built. In 1949, Little America moved to its present location at Exit 68 along the proposed route for the I-80 interstate. In 1952, Earl Holding, Covey's son-in-law, began managing it. Later, he purchased the business. By the 1960s, it billed itself as the largest gas station in the world, with 55 pumps. Today, long after many mom-and-pop cabin courts have faded away, Little America is still a popular Lincoln Highway vestige along I-80.
Rawlins was our halting place for the night. It is a pleasant town with wide streets and plenty of sunshine. In Rawlins, as in most Western towns, we stayed at a hotel managed on the European plan and ate our meals in a nearby restaurant. It is always a surprise to me to see the number of people in the restaurants and cafeterias of the West. Even in small towns, these places are crowded. Effie Price Gladding.
The hotel she was referring to was the Ferris Hotel, a downtown Rawlins landmark since 1901. After falling into disrepair, it was demolished in 1999. But the Ferris Mansion still stands in Rawlins. Lincoln Highway travelers must have gawked at this elaborate Queen Anne-style building. Today, it's currently run as a B&B for modern highway travelers. Westward from Rawlins, the route of the Lincoln Highway crosses the Continental Divide and enters the Great Divide Basin. Here, water flows neither east nor west, but simply evaporates into thin air. It is the beginning of the Red Desert at over 9,000 square miles, the largest unfenced area in the continental United States. Some Lincoln Highway travelers loved the desert.
The Wyoming desert has a sharper and more vivid coloring than that of Nevada. The tableland is more rolling, and the mountains are farther away. The smell of the sagebrush, pungent and aromatic, is in my nostrils from day to day. I love it in its cleanness and spiciness, and shall be sorry when we have left the desert behind us. Effie Price Gladding.
Others couldn't wait to cross it. One traveler called the Red Desert a place where even the prairie dogs, rattlesnakes, and coyotes had given up the country in disgust. The Lincoln Highway in this part of Wyoming followed the old Union Pacific railbed, or more precisely, it was the abandoned railbed.
So in 1913, when they established the first grade, they simply put people going down these railroad grades. And they were better than virtually any other thing in Wyoming because they were raised berms. You were up out of the mud. They were well drained. Moisture would drain off of them. So what they did was they just kind of cropped the top off of these grades, widened them, dumped the dirt on the sides, and turned them into a rather narrow two-lane road.
With increased traffic after 1920, major changes were required in grade, alignment, and bridges. The Lincoln Highway Association helped the state complete 105 miles of graded gravel.
We're standing on a segment of the 1920s Lincoln Highway. This is the first purpose-built version of the highway. It's a berm, 24-foot wide, two-lane, generally covered with crushed rock, similar to the ballast that the Union Pacific Railroad used on its tracks, occasionally covered with oil in places to stabilize the berm, but very rarely paved, at least until the 1930s. This is the last version of the Lincoln Highway. We refer to it as the 1930s variant, although officially it is United States Highway US 30. This version was built between the mid-1930s and the early 1940s. It is a very typical two-lane highway, 36-foot wide, paved with traffic lines, signs, everything that a modern highway would have.
Rock Springs has been a coal town since the days of the Transcontinental Railroad. It's also the home of a Lincoln Highway landmark. The Rock Springs Coal Archway was erected over the Lincoln Highway in 1928. As automobilists passed under it, they had to watch their progress. The speed limit through Rock Springs was 8 miles per hour, one of the lowest along the entire road. Yet another source of potential income provided by the Lincoln Highway for cities and towns along its route.
The Butte scenery both approaching and leaving Green River was very fine. The coloring was extremely rich, soft reds, yellows, browns, and clay colors. There were long lines of round buttresses and great concavities of rock, more like the famous Causse of southern France than anything I have ever seen. Effie Price Gladding.
In 1913, travelers on the Lincoln Highway crossed the Green River over an old wagon bridge. It was considered Wyoming's worst section of the Lincoln Highway. But in 1922, the state built a new highway bridge and shifted the route. What was once dreaded by travelers now turned into a beautiful crossing. This second-generation highway passed the foot of Tollgate Rock and along the base of the spectacular Green River Palisades. It then crossed the longest Lincoln Highway span in Wyoming, the 286-foot-long Green River Bridge. Tourists driving to Yellowstone Park headed northwest at Little America. Those staying on the Lincoln veered west-southwest. On the way, Lincoln Highway travelers marveled at the unusual rock formations of Church Butte.
The Wyoming buttes are wonderfully carved by wind and sand and weather, and many of them present a mysterious and imposing appearance. Often they are tablelands, rising square and massive against the horizon like immense fortresses. Effie Price Gladding.
Further down the road, they passed through Lyman, originally a Mormon settlement founded in 1898. The town of Fort Bridger was originally a trading post built by famed trapper and mountain man Jim Bridger in 1843. It was a supply stop for travelers along the Oregon Trail and later the Overland Stage and Pony Express. Lincoln Highway auto tourists also stopped here and stayed at the black and orange tourist cabins with attached garages. They've been recently restored by the state of Wyoming. The stretch of Lincoln Highway from Fort Bridger to Evanston, even as late as 1919, was abysmal, but it had its scenic pleasures.
One of the famous landmarks that's just about 12 miles east of here is called Eagle Rock. And it was a famous landmark on the road. And if one is collecting Lincoln Highway trivia, memorabilia, you often come across a postcard with that image of the Eagle Rock.
After a long day's drive through Wyoming's arid climate, one of Evanston's roadside businesses catered not only to the lodging needs of Lincoln Highway tourists, but to their thirsts as well.
Pete's Rock and Ride Club, which is just outside the city limits of Evanston, was built probably in the 40s. It's a famous landmark in Evanston because it was a local watering hole.
Well, it was a little roadhouse that was patronized by people in the 40s and 50s. My dad and his brother had built some tourist cabins, and I grew up in cabin number 6. Every morning I woke up to new neighbors and their wonderful road stories. And then years later, the bulldozers buried our place to make a new highway, and I relocated here to continue my romance with the road. Now I open on weekends, put in a tough 12-hour week sitting over on that stool over there and shooting the breeze with my regulars, both of whom I love dearly.
As the Lincoln Highway Association lobbied state and federal governments to support road construction, Washington began to listen, particularly the Department of Defense. In 1919, Lincoln Highway Association Field Secretary Harry Osterman persuaded the War Department to organize a motor convoy. It would navigate the Lincoln Highway from coast to coast. Comprised of nearly 300 soldiers and 80 vehicles, the convoy set out to demonstrate the practicality of cross-country motorized troop movement. A last-minute addition to that convoy was a young lieutenant colonel whose experiences on this trip would years later, ironically, spell the end of the Lincoln Highway. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower. The trip required many repairs on military vehicles, as well as rebuilding bridges that could not support the heavy loads.
Wyoming roads west of Cheyenne are poor dirt ones with weak culverts and bridges. In one day, 14 of these were counted, broken through by the train. The desert roads in the southwest portion of this state are very poor. Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower.
The convoy finally made it to San Francisco after 62 arduous days. In the end, this military exercise was successful in convincing the government that paved roads were essential to the country's national defense. It was a PR triumph for Osterman. All the efforts of the Lincoln Highway Association were now aimed at getting local, state, and federal governments involved in the business of road building. The Federal Highway Act of 1921 provided matching funds to states for road construction to the tune of $75 million. Roads in America began to rapidly improve. With better roads, the idea of a long road trip by auto was now really catching on. Women in particular boldly embraced the idea of the American road trip. Some in an attempt to promote women's rights, others simply exercising their newfound independence.
They could get in the automobile and drive to town and go to a social circle, or perhaps even engage in business, as many women began to do. It was a great freeing thing for all segments of society, but particularly for women, because they had a mobility that they had not had before.
Dr. Grace Raymond Hebard was a Wyoming historian in the early part of the 20th century, and she owned a car and traveled around Wyoming looking for historic sites, and also she became very much involved in the the historical marking work that was more or less a hallmark of the progressive era of marking places of historical importance. Many times she would be out driving around looking at these historic sites, and something would go wrong with her car, and she would have to climb underneath and figure out how to fix one part or another. One aspect that was very important for Wyoming was the historical landmarks that she set up, because they were all predicated on the fact that automobiles could stop there and could read about the historical event that had occurred.
With the Highway Act of 1921, the involvement of the federal government marked the beginning of the end for the Lincoln Highway. Now that matching dollars were available to states, new roads with a variety of names popped up around the country.
And there were hundreds of named roads by that time. And it was a confusing spaghetti bowl of roads in many places. You'd have 6 or 8 named highways coming together at one place, and you're trying to read the signs of all of them. It was a very poor arrangement. It was very difficult for the motorists to get anywhere by following these signs.
Washington stepped in once again and proposed a numbering convention. All national highways would now be identified by a federal shield, including the highway number. Route markers and signs for named highways were removed. The Lincoln Highway was designated as U.S. Route 30 for much of its length, but it also became U.S. 1, U.S. 530, U.S. 40, and U.S. 50 in other areas. In the fall of 1926, the Board of Directors of the Lincoln Highway Association voted to cease operations at the end of 1927. They realized that their goal of an intercontinental network of highways was coming to fruition. But there was one final publicity attempt in September 1928. Thousands of Boy Scouts across the country placed cast concrete Lincoln Highway markers at sites along the route. These red, white, and blue markers held a brass medallion of Lincoln's head and directional arrows to mark the way. In all, nearly 3,000 of these now iconic posts were positioned. By the 25th anniversary of the Lincoln Highway in 1938, nearly the entire route had been paved. On that anniversary, NBC broadcast a radio program that featured interviews with former Lincoln Highway Association officials and a message from Carl Fisher.
The Lincoln Highway Association has accomplished its primary purpose, that of providing an object lesson to show the possibility in highway transportation. Now, I believe the country is at the beginning of another new era in highway building that will create a system of roads far beyond the dreams of the Lincoln Highway founders. Carl G. Fisher.
Fisher died the following year. He had lost most of his fortune to the Wall Street crash of 1929. Henry Joy died on November 6, 1936. As a general route, the Lincoln Highway, in its new numbered persona, was now being used more than ever, but it soon gave way to an even bigger idea. Dwight Eisenhower, after his experiences with the Army convoy of 1919 and his admiration of the Autobahn during World War II, had a vision for something similar in America, a nationwide network of limited access highways. When he became president in 1953, he held true to his dream, signing the Federal Aid Highway Acts of 1954 and 1956. Construction on the interstate highway system soon began. It took 30 years to fully complete. Now, the Lincoln Highway was truly gone. In its place and covering much of its course from New Jersey to California was I-80. Many portions of the Lincoln Highway lay vacant and in ruins today. Other sections are still used as local routes through many states. In Wyoming, some areas of the old abandoned highway can be seen running alongside the current I-80. In the 1980s, a new interest in the Lincoln Highway began to develop, much of it due to a book. A photographic essay by Drake Hokanson.
He talked about the emotion of the road, getting off the interstate, rediscovering America again, and the fascination of this road and how it kind of faded out of the public consciousness. And that book influenced a lot of people. We owe a lot to Drake Hokanson for writing that book.
I've long been very compelled by history and by a sense of the hard work that people have done for many generations to create what we have today. How we travel, how we understand the land, how we know who we are. It's very powerful.
A new Lincoln Highway Association was formed in 1992 with the mission to identify, preserve, and improve access to the remaining portions of the Lincoln Highway and its associated historic sites. In the summer of 2013, 270 members from around the world traveled by car from both coasts to Kearney, Nebraska for a centennial celebration. 100 years on the Lincoln Highway.
Dust from the desert was inside the laptop on the keyboard. That's how bad the alkali dust is.
He and I became known around town as the old man with the old car and the dog in the backseat.
Torbjørn Lorentzen from Norway, Tromsø, Norway, north of the Arctic Circle.
Cold up there?
No, not so cold. Compared to here, yes, you're cold.
Oh, darling, let it rain, let it snow, let the cold north winds blow, just as long as you love me.
Yeah, I travel alone in my own car. Convertible black Mustang. I've been traveling all over America. Traveling and driving, feeling free when I'm traveling alone.
You on past the freeway and going into the next dirt road.
We are temporary custodians of these vehicles. In 20 or 30 or 40 years, somebody else needs to be custodian so these cars don't wind up in museums. We want them on the road, on tours like this, so people can see them, know what Packard is, know what Packard's all about, and get interested in owning one of these Packards someday. And that goal was accomplished today in one small way.
Today, we zip across the country on divided, limited-access interstates. The Lincoln Highway has, for the most part, been eliminated. The routing of Interstate 80 has taken its toll on once thriving towns, including those in Wyoming. I-80 now bypasses such places as Bosler and Medicine Bow, Lyman and Fort Bridger.
Today, what's the goal? Get there as fast as we can. We don't stop in places like Rock River and Medicine Bow to get fuel. We pull off at the big truck stops, we top off our tank, we get back on the interstate and drive as fast as we can.
We've become such a fast society because so much of travel today is simply the destination. The act of the actual travel itself has gone by the wayside. The Lincoln Highway offers the opportunity. You don't have to have a destination. You can just get in the car and go as far as you want. And sometimes it's just take 4 hours, take 4 days, take 4 weeks.
Well, it's sad because too many people think that the only way to get someplace is the fastest speed on the road that's boring. Get on I-80 and you miss the fun of the old road and the Lincoln Highway and the mom and pop restaurant and the tourist cabins.
There's a great opportunity for us out there today to find these old pieces of the Lincoln Highway. Just slow down. The term that gets used a lot is slow travel. How can I slow down and explore some of my own country in ways that are similar to the ways that the early automobile travelers did in the early part of the 20th century?
We have a new conception of our great country, her vastness, her varied scenery, her prosperity, her happiness, her boundless resources, her immense possibilities, her kindness and hopefulness. We are bound to her by 1,000 new ties of acquaintance, of association, and of pride. Effie Price Gladding.
For those who truly want to experience America and relive what those early auto pioneers on the Lincoln Highway experienced, get off the interstate and seek out those portions of the old road. Slow down and savor the joy of auto touring. Discover the fascinating history not only of the Lincoln Highway, but of America itself. Get away from the mundane and ordinary and understand what those who pioneered the way knew, that getting there is half the fun. After 100 years on the Lincoln Highway, it's still the journey that counts.
Down the road, how far you going, Mac? We're looking for the Lincoln Highway down the road.